segue into my brief comments, because I think that both comments have set the framework for where we are today. That basically we have a sense of the challenges we have before us. The question we have to grapple with is, how do we respond to these objective conditions? Where we are here as a movement, as a emerging human rights movement, is to, in fact, tackle that critical question, Dion. How do we build a new kind of human rights approach? One in which we recognize that the only way we're going to really be able to realize, sustain, and advance what we call progressive human rights is if there is, in fact, a shift in power. If there is, in fact, a transformation of social relationships, institutions, and structures that inform and serve as a basis for the continued oppression of people here in this country. So what we have to grapple with, and is really the rationale, the reason for us coming together this weekend, is to talk about how we build a new kind of movement that in fact supports organizing in this period. Because if we're not grappling with that question, if we're not building organization, if we're not grounding this movement in the movement of the most oppressed, then we have to raise the question, what in fact is the value of human rights? Now, many of us argue that the value of human rights is that it does provide that instrument, that weapon we need to transform consciousness, to support the movement for social change that will result in a shift in power, that in fact serves as a framework and basis for the kind of revolutionary objectives we have to embrace at this period. I think it's important to note that for many of us, when we began to try to consolidate this human rights piece, that we did this during the 1990s. It's when that process sort of intensified. And this was a period of relative prosperity, if you will, according to the propagandists of the Democratic Party. But many of us recognize, visionary folks recognize, that this so-called prosperity was uneven, that many of our communities were suffering, that in fact we had to find new language and a new conception to begin to talk to our people in order to organize our people to begin to address the ongoing sufferings of our people. So we recognize that the human rights, at least a people-centered human rights conception, was the way to go. And we have some of these people in this room today, people like Loretta Ross, Sherry Hunkela, folks, many of you in this room today who recognize that basically we had a responsibility to begin to lay the framework, the foundation for a more sustained movement, that if we were going to talk about social change and human rights, we had to make sure that we were talking about the same thing. That in fact, social change, human rights, and the struggle for democracy were the three pillars of a transformative approach to how we should be engaged in politics here in this country. So that process of building the foundation started in the 1990s. And it was a visionary and correct process. We started that process in a situation where we still had folks who were engaged in some of the more traditional approaches to human rights, advocates who, many are based in D.C., many who are attorneys, who saw human rights as only something that was relevant out there, outside the country, that had no real connection to the conditions of people and structures here in this country. Well, that perception still exists. That notion that human rights is something that's out there, that is only connected to individual rights, it still exists. But those of us who've been building a new human rights movement recognize that, of course, human rights apply here, and that they transcend individual rights, that they also include collective rights. We also recognize as we build this movement that while we will begin with the texts, the various treaties that have been ratified or not ratified, that language, those words in that text are merely contingent and must be contested. That is, as we build this movement, we will determine ourselves what the meaning of those words are. And if we see we need to go beyond those words, we will. We create human rights through struggle. So they can serve as a foundation, but they can't and they won't limit us. They're not going to define the limits of our humanity. Okay? That comes out of struggle. So we go forward and we build this movement. We engage in a process of reaching out across the country to folks who are engaged in social change work, and we say, check out this instrument, check out this human rights idea, see to what extent this notion of human rights that raises fundamental questions about the role of the state, justice, democracy, see if this can provide additional content to your social justice claims. Because we believe that it does. We believe that in this era of ideological confusion, where we cannot get clarity or agreement on our ideological lines, that until we get that, we can use the human rights conception as a critical lens to not only assess and analyze our objective conditions, but to talk about and introduce principles of social justice that most of us can agree on. Okay? So the hard work of developing social theory and ideological clarity continues, but in the meantime, we have an instrument that we can use to organize and to educate people across this country. Okay? So as we've been building this movement now, we're at a point now where basically we have the critical mass, I believe, to begin to really define the progressive character of this movement, to ensure that those of us who are connected to democracy and supportive of democracy, base building, that we have the ability now to drive the human rights notion forward. That within the human rights community, that we can assert that, again, if we're not supporting the notion of social change, base building and organizing, if we're not attempting to build critical consciousness, then basically we should just do something else and call ourselves something else besides human rights defenders. Okay? So this weekend, we want to continue that conversation. This network is a network of all of us. The coordinating office in Atlanta is just that, a coordinating office. Okay? We have to deal with and work with all of the various elements that are part of this network. It's not a coalition. It's not an alliance. It's a network of organizations and individuals who are grappling with a vision for how we advance this work in a progressive way. Okay? So we're saying that this weekend is the weekend for you to take this network completely, to give it its content, to determine its direction, to grapple with how this framework can be used in a progressive way, and to give us guidance, all of us collectively guidance on how we're going to work these next few years, because as we all understand, this is in fact a critical moment. That we have certain opportunities, but unless we are organized, unless we figure out how to build our own capacities, we're not going to be able to take full advantage of this critical moment. So we say, let's struggle, let's put things on the table, let's deal with all of the contradictions, and let's go forward and build us a real people-centered human rights movement.
Okay, we're going to now split into 3 groups to have some further conversation before we come back as a whole group